Hello, everybody. We are back. It took a little bit to get the kinks worked out, but I hope you can appreciate that sometimes scientist life is a little bit busy. So here we are with second episode, and we should probably introduce ourselves for anybody that did not watch our first episode. My name is Dominic Noche. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in wildlife biology from the University of Montana, worked on a variety of different wildlife projects, mostly with mammalian carnivores. Currently doing small and medium-sized carnivore work, mostly with bobcats in the Adirondack Mountains of New York.
And I'm Justin Ruby. I also graduated with my bachelor's in wildlife biology from the University of Montana. I have spent time working as a research technician, writing scientific manuscripts, and currently am working a lot with science education. And so we are the Wildlife Wire, and on today's episode, we are talking about the okapi.
And the Okapi it's a pretty popular ungulate, but it is a bit more on the obscure side. And I think to start things off, we just have to say that as far as ungulates go, this guy is weird.
Mm-hmm.
How weird? Well, you're going to have to listen to the rest of this video. But the okapi, which the scientific name is Okapia johnstoni, was an animal that was so narrow in geographic range and so elusive that Western science didn't even know about its existence until the beginning of the 20th century. So this is an animal that really, really did elude the eye of European explorers for a very long time. It was, of course, known to the local people, the Moody Pygmies, which mostly are from the Democratic Republic of Congo. This animal also used to be found in Western Uganda, but it is very much a jungle specialist. And it wasn't until British exploration in this general region in the late 1800s, 1880s, 1890s, that explorers started hearing about an animal that was described as a forest zebra or a forest donkey, and eventually became nicknamed the African unicorn. So this was an animal that had a very mythical, very legendary status within the Western science community. And it wasn't until the late 1890s when Sir Harry Johnston went into Western Uganda and was contacting with the local pygmies, and they spoke about this animal. They knew this animal well from where their villages were, and he was eventually able to get his hands on some skin impressions from the animal's hind flanks. And later on, he eventually did get a skull. But first, he sent these flanks back to Britain. And as you can see on the okapi, it has very zebra-like stripes on its flanks. And the belief right now is that the reason it has those kind of white stripes along a mostly dark body is that it assists a little bit with camouflage, with the light kind of peeling through the canopy and creating kind of those light stripes naturally out of light. It helps conceal the animal better by mimicking that. But because of these stripes, that is something that we very much associate with the zebra. So it was initially classified as a species of horse, and it wasn't until Harry Johnston got the skull to Britain and scientists were really able to take a look at the skull that is realized that this is actually a relative of the giraffe. So most people know giraffes really well. This is a relative of the giraffe. For a long time, we thought that those were the only two species of the giraffe family, but I think we'll save it for the reticulated giraffe video because giraffe taxonomy is just generally really weird. Mm-hmm. But the giraffe and the okapi shared a common ancestor at about 11.5 million years ago. And the okapi split and became more of a forest specialist. And that's part of what makes the Okapi really weird. But I guess to start off, let's talk about some things about the Okapi that associate it with the giraffe. And so this is a male Okapi, and you can see these little nubs just above on the top of the head. And those people will call those horns, but they're technically not horns. It's a different structure that's unique to the giraffe family, and they're called ossicones. Both sexes of giraffe have ossicones, but in Okapi, only the males have them. And just looking at these ossicones on this Okapi, they look a little long to me. I don't know. I mean, the ossicones are pretty darn short on the Okapi. And yeah, these ones, they just look really big and really long to me. I feel like they should have made them a little bit smaller. I don't know about you, Justin.
No, I think I agree because they do seem a little big. And I think another thing to point out about the ossicones is people will call them horns, but they're not horns, especially because on the outside of horns, there's a keratin like sheath that kind of goes over the bone underneath. But with ossicones, they're essentially just bone with hair and like skin on top. So it's kind of like a big divergence from other ungulates, especially.
Right. And I guess that is a good point to bring up is let's just talk a little bit about ungulate taxonomy to start off for people. So you have two types of ungulates. You have ungulates with an odd number of toes, which are in the order Perissodactyla, and you have ungulates with an even number of toes, which are in the order Artiodactyla. And this is back when we were classifying animals more so based on skeletal traits that they had in common rather than, okay, who is the closest common ancestor? And the reason I bring that up is because whales are technically artiodactyls. When we look at genetic analysis, whales are within that group. So to look at Artiodactyla, which has now been renamed Set Artiodactyla to incorporate cetaceans, what we see amongst the families is that there's a couple of splits. So the very first split was the camels. Camels, despite how somewhat normal they look for ungulates, they're really weird as well. And they have a lot of weird skeletal features. And we'll go into it on the camel video. The next split off was the pig groups. So the true pigs and the peccaries, because the peccaries are not true pigs, they split off and then split up independently. Next, you had the split that would lead to the hippopotamuses and the whales. And finally, you have the ruminants, which is everything else. So giraffes, antelope, deer, and then, bovids, that's kind of the miscellaneous category that everything else is in. Cattle, sheep, goats, gazelles, every crazy thing in between is in bovidae. So each of those ruminant groups developed their own headgear independently. So when they were splitting off, they had very basal headgear that was probably just comprised of bone, and then they all independently evolved different ways of structuring that headgear to protect it the best way. And the giraffe family decided to go with this ossicone structure for at least its living members. And I think the other thing to mention here with the giraffe in terms of traits is the long tongue that is sticking out from time to time. Okapi tongues, like giraffe tongues, are prehensile, which means that they're able to grab things really easily. So they'll actually use them to coil around small branches and pull branches down and pick off the leaves from the stems. Very, very useful in that regard. And the Okapi even takes it a little bit further, which I find intriguing, that the tongue is actually used for a lot of personal grooming, especially around the eyes and the ears. They'll groom those sensitive areas with their tongue to keep them clean and presumably to keep their senses sharp, which is really interesting. And as far as I know, I don't think we really see that in giraffes. So that's something unique to the Okapi. Giraffes, it's more of a bluish colored tongue, whereas with the Okapi, it's a very dark blue, sometimes described as black. But those are kind of the major external differences or similarities that you see between giraffe and okapi, which lets you into this hint that the okapi is in fact a giraffe relative and not a type of horse.
Yeah, and while we're on the kind of subject of, adaptation, if we look at the okapi, one thing I'm also noticing is very big ears. Like these animals have very large, kind of roundish ears, which I feel like these ones are pretty good, maybe a little too like pointy, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
But for a species that lives primarily in, a dense forest, those probably help them a lot with finding if predators are around, hearing like the snap of a branch, so they can help avoid, or probably also to hear other okapi.
Right. And actually, one cool thing that I found doing my research is that okapis are actually capable of something called infrasound,
Mhm.
which is basically infrasound means below sound. So it's a sound frequency that's so low that we can't hear it. But the okapis have a way to detect these low frequencies to communicate with each other, because what we didn't mention yet is that this is a solitary animal that actually defends a territory. And so they're not really interacting with their own kind that much, but they need to get together when they're ready to breed. So this is a way for them to communicate with each other. They also use scent markings as well, just like a lot of territorial carnivores do. And that infrasonic communication is thought to be a way to really avoid predator detection, which I found really, really interesting. And I just want to bring this up because I'm noticing it in the light, because I wasn't sure if the model captured this, but I really think it does. Is you can kind of see some grooves there on the face. And when you look at okapi pictures, you always see kind of these grooves running along the face that I don't know if it's either part of the skull bone structure or if they're blood vessels that are just visible externally. But I didn't think that the model actually captured that. And I could see from that lighting that it kind of slightly does,
Yeah,
which impresses me.
yeah, that is impressive.
Because I thought I was gonna be docking points for that. But
Oh, yeah,
also
no, I see exactly what you mean.
we can look at the
Yeah.
female too. So the females come out here. And you can see that the female does not have ossicones, which
Hmm.
is accurate. However, instead of ossicones, they do have these little hair whorls or hair tufts that kind of stick out like little bumps that in that specific area, but they don't have the ossicones themselves.
Okay, we got a calf.
Yep. Then we got the calf as well. So in terms of what we're talking about with the Okapi has a very narrow range, as I kind of alluded to before. They're doing a little bit of social interaction. Not something we really know a whole lot about, because as I said, these are solitary animals living in thick jungle, so we don't really see them interact at all whatsoever. But we would assume that part of being solitary means they'd be a little bit territorial.
Yeah. And, like we were saying, these are solitary animals that live in the dense jungle. So this part of the environment would be really atypical for them to be in, like probably essentially unheard of, because they
Yeah,
avoid,
like this is maybe if they're crossing to get to another patch of forest, and
yeah,
it's probably more that it's been an ag field that's been cleared out by human influence rather than something natural. They will use trails in the forest, which we have replicated to because these are living alongside elephants, specifically the forest elephant. So they will use trails that are made by forest elephants for easier travel through the jungle, but they don't like those really big open areas.
yeah,
They want to stay sheltered. So when we say thick jungle, this is really limited to, for the most part, thick jungle in the Congo Basin, mostly in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, formerly known as Zaire, and a great bulk of that is specifically in the Ituri forest. However, I did mention that when Sir Harry Johnston was doing a lot of his discoveries, that he was working in Uganda. And we do know that at least historically, there were Okapi in Western Uganda. However, there were some recent expeditions to look for evidence of Okapi in Western Uganda, and they turned up empty. So it seems like the Okapi is currently extinct in Uganda. And so it's only left in the DRC which makes it very important culturally to that country. And it's what we call an endemic species. It's not found in any other country in the world. And so that makes what the DRC does for okapi and okapi habitat all the more critical, because it's the only place where they're left in the wild.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really interesting because despite their very limited range and like population size from what we know, and actually what we don't know because they're so elusive, from genetic analysis, these are actually a very diverse, like genetically diverse species for an endangered species, which is really uncommon because usually when we have an endangered species, the genetic diversity is very, very low because the number of individuals is scarily low to where, you know, this species is at risk of potential extinction eventually.
Right. And I think that helps due to the fact that it's so localized.
Mm-hmm.
And really what we see with okapi threats is, in terms of natural mortality, the big thing that might surprise some people is the only predator of the okapi is the leopard, which okapis are fairly big. As I said, they're a giraffe relative. And while they don't get nearly as big as giraffes do, they're still reaching, 275 kilograms maybe for a small one. That's a big animal, but they're not that aggressive. They're quite shy, they're quite elusive. And leopards in the Congo Basin, they know how to tackle them. So there was a radio collar study done, I think it was sometime in the 1980s, I want to say, maybe early 1990s. And they radio collared 13 okapis, and 3 of them were killed by leopard. And there's been plenty more sightings by the locals of okapis with leopard scars. So we know that leopards will hunt them. And especially in areas like the Congo Basin for leopards, they get a little bit bigger and they're not competing in that habitat with larger predators like lion and spotted hyena. So they're going to be more comfortable taking larger prey because they can more easily monopolize a carcass in that type of habitat and not need to stash it in a tree like they'd have to do out in the savannas.
Yeah.
So leopards are their one major predator, but in terms of core threats, a lot of what we see with the okapi comes from habitat destruction of the Congo Basin. This is an animal that's held in very high regard by the local people, and it's very often seen as a sacred species that isn't allowed to be hunted, or maybe only chiefs can hunt it on occasion. And if it's accidentally killed, there's a vigil to, for that animal's death. So okapi intentional mortality is not as common. It's started to become increasingly common with the bushmeat market rising and people wanting to find their own wild sources of meat to sell. But at the core, it's mostly habitat destruction, which comes from the need for timber as well as for mining precious metals. So a lot of metals that you find in technology, such as your cell phones and things like that, a lot of that comes out of West and Central Africa. And it's in these areas that have a lot of these big endemic megafauna species, and it threatens their habitats, just like okapi and gorillas and chimpanzees and forest elephants. So habitat destruction is the main concern with okapi. And what happened during the last IUCN assessment is that this was an animal that was listed as near threatened previously. So it wasn't in even the sphere of being concerned. Vulnerable, the next one up, is when conservation groups start getting really concerned. And what people saw was that there was just such a significant population decline since 1985, I want to say, to the point that it shot straight up to being listed as endangered. So this is an animal that's currently listed as endangered. It went all the way from near threatened to endangered with one assessment. And so I think in 1984, the Okapi Conservation Project conservation group was established, and they really have devoted a lot of work to preserving the okapi in the DRC, including helping establish the Okapi Forest Reserve, which covers about a fifth or a sixth of the current okapi habitat, which is huge. And they also do a lot of community engagement, which is great to see. As I said, habitat destruction is the big issue here. And so a lot of the programs that Okapi Conservation Project works on is with the local communities and addressing the community's needs. And so a lot of that includes helping them practice sustainable agroforestry. So being able to do sustainable agriculture in tandem with the forest and not needing to clear cut it for these giant agriculture fields so that the jungle stays intact. And even working on empowering women's groups and allowing women to have access to things like sewing machines so that they can make their own income and have more of an influence in their community. And even during the COVID-19 pandemic, they were using their sewing machines to make masks for the country and then sell the surplus masks to gain a little bit of extra income. And a lot of community engagement with school children learning about the unique endemic life that they have in this biodiverse region and why it's important to protect it. And these are all things that may not be what you'd first think about for conserving an animal like the okapi, but it is just as important. The people are living there long term, and it really shows that that can be some great effectiveness for conservation. And as conservationists, we need to really branch out and think long term and think about sustainability and how to best have coexistence. And it seems like a great plan that's been working in the okapi's favor so far.
Absolutely. Yeah. The community aspect of conservation is so important. It's something that without that community engagement and participation, you really can't have successful conservation because you need kind of everyone doing their part and finding the importance in these species to really effectively conserve them.
Right. And as we said, this guy is weird. He
Hmm.
needs this thick for an ungulate of his size, needing this thick, old growth, unfragmented forest is very strange. This is an animal that feeds almost entirely on understory plants that usually aren't the best in quality, but they still make it work. And it's the only ungulate that does that on the face of the planet right now. So
Yeah.
can't stress enough how weird this animal is, and that means that it has very unique habitat requirements for its group.
And which
Uh,
is really interesting because, for an animal that, has all this effective conservation happening with the community, it's not a very charismatic species. It's not the most adorable or, you know, uh, I guess because it's kind of, like you said, it's weird.
it's
It doesn't
charismatic to them. Like
true, yeah,
they love this thing. I mean, it's on their
yeah,
currency.
absolutely. But I meant to like the outside world, like people wouldn't say like, oh, the okapi, that's my favorite animal because it's not super well known or common, and it doesn't have kind of like the spots of a giraffe or the big tusks of an elephant. It's kind of got this weird coloration and cool striping, but it just seems like a species that for anyone who isn't from the area where this animal is would easily be forgotten, essentially.
Justin, do you want to guess what my mom's favorite animal is
Is it
since
the
you brought that
okapi?
up? Yeah, she loves
Nice.
okapis. But yeah, I think where I would say the okapi is, I mean, it's consistently made it into all the zoo sims. So
True.
I think for its obscurity, it's surprisingly popular with people. And I think
Yeah.
part of that is that it is, it's closely related to the giraffe, but it looks
Mhm.
very different. And I
Yeah.
think that it's like the pygmy hippo. I think that helps prop it up. And so a lot of
Mm.
Africa games will just kind of throw it in for some variety,
Yeah.
not realizing, oh, it's only found in like one
One
country
area.
and it's very different to like all the stereotypical places that
Yeah.
they're usually basing their African landscapes on. But yeah, this is a weird guy. And I think this is a good point to kind of talk about rumination as a whole and why eating understory plants is so weird.
Yeah. Okay. So rumination is a really interesting process. So for a lot of animals, eating plants is difficult. It's not something that your body just easily digests. That's why a lot of, when people eat it, it's not a main portion of our diet. We don't have the systems in our body to break down the cellulose and the other aspects of plants that these animals can. So in their body, their stomach is essentially split up into four components. And I have each four here so I don't get them wrong. We've got the reticulum, the rumen, the omasum, and the
Abomasum, I think.
abomasum. Thank you. And so essentially within the rumen, they've got microbes in their gut. And so what it does is it helps break down and ferment the cellulose, or the plant matter, I should say, and into usable energy essentially. So what this animal does is it breaks it down into fatty acids and vitamins and amino acids, which it uses to build its own body, to build, the everything from its cells to everything. So for carnivores, breaking down meat is really easy. It's, breaking down you is easier than breaking down something that's so distantly connected to you. Plants are on a whole different taxonomy, and we're just so divergent from them that their whole systems is kind of, it's weird compared to us.
I think a good thing to bring up too is just the reason that plants are hard to digest is because of cellulose. So like
Yeah.
when you have your biology class and they put the plant cell and the animal cell next to each other, that whole cell wall, plants don't have bones, so they have that cell wall made of cellulose to make them really rigid. That's really hard to break down. That's the big component that is super duper hard to break down. And there's only certain bacteria that can do it, that have to live in these giant fermentation chambers.
Yeah.
And so artiodactyls, the even-toed ungulates, they put that at the front, with the ruminants being the most specialized, with having all the different chambers, that many chambers and how specialized the chambers are. Whereas the perissodactyls, so horses, rhinos, and even some other animals that aren't ungulates, like elephants, do this as well. They have it in the hind gut. So they have their normal stomach, normal digestive system. Then they have an organ called a cecum, where all the bacteria are, and that's how they digest it. And so those are two different strategies to do the same thing. And that's what humans used to do. Gorillas have a cecum. They're one of those animals that do hindgut. Our appendix is a vestigial cecum. So it used to work, and through evolution and humans moving more to eating more meat and fruit and roots and plant materials that don't have cellulose in them, we lost our appendix. It wasn't as necessary anymore, so it doesn't really work.
Yeah.
And then, is there anything else? Oh, so a big thing that you'll hear from a lot of your elementary school teachers when they talk about rumination is that they'll say, oh, it's like what cows do. And we have, as we've said, there's a lot more than just cows that do this. Sheep do it, giraffes do it, deer do it. And then they'll also say it's 4 stomachs. And Justin had listed off those different types of rumen, the reticulum. That's still one stomach.
Yeah.
It's one stomach with 4 chambers. Because if you had 4 stomachs, you wouldn't be able to function.
Exactly.
So that's an important distinction that gets lost a lot. Mm-hmm. So it's not 4 stomachs. They have one stomach with 4 chambers.
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
Well, I think one of the other interesting things about ruminants is when biologists are sedating them, you have to be really conscious about essentially the animal's placement.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because of these very specialized stomachs and like the gases in their stomachs, if they're not laying down correctly, then you can get some real dangerous issues that put the animal's health at risk.
Yeah, you have to make sure that airway is clear too, so that the gases can escape. Because as we said, it's a fermentation chamber. So those bacteria in that gut, they're constantly releasing these different gases that help break down this plant material. But if the animal's not functioning and you've got it drugged, you need to make sure that those processes can still happen without damaging the animal. So that's a big thing that you learn when you're immobilizing ruminants with drugs, for sure.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think. Anything else we should say about rumination?
I think this is great that we got this one early, because it's going to be a shorter video anyway, and it gives us a chance to really talk about rumination in detail, because it'll come up constantly. There's a lot of ruminants that are in Planet Zoo.
And I think so. Yeah. So Any other points you want to make about rumination or anything we think we missed?
I don't think so. I think, just understanding that, I guess, when it comes to plants versus meat, they come with different challenges. We talked
Hmm.
about this in our last video on the Amur leopard, that eating meat, it's simple to digest, but you have the challenge of catching it and
Yeah.
catching it without getting seriously injured. Plants aren't going to injure you that much physically. Like, sure, there's, some plants with toxins and some plants with thorns, but at its core, the problem is converting it into energy and
Hmm.
being able to break down those tough compounds. That's what plants use to defend themselves from herbivores. They're not just sitting there. Not all plants are equal. And that's something that I feel like gets skipped over a lot. So herbivores have a lot of really great adaptations, like the rumination digestive system, to really tackle this tough issue of having to digest plant matter.
And I think another point to kind of really highlight again was the difference between animal cells versus plant cells. Plant cells, like they were saying, are very rigid because they don't have bones, like Dominic was saying. So they need that for the structure. Whereas animal cells, we have bones, so that's what our body builds onto. So all our cells are essentially like they're squishy. They're easy to kind of, burst and break down. Whereas
Yeah.
plants, it's a whole other ball game.
It's kind of like a Jolly Rancher versus a Laffy Taffy.
Exactly. Or maybe a Jolly Rancher versus a Gusher.
Yeah, a Gusher is probably better, like a fruit snack.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then what was it? There's something else I was gonna add. Oh, so part of that is we talked about with carnivores during the Amur leopard video that they have to conserve a lot of energy because it's hard to come by catching your food. So cats tend to spend a lot of time sleeping to conserve that energy. With herbivores, you have the opposite issue where your food is low in nutrition. It takes a long time because you're regurgitating it. That's what chewing the cud is. You put it through the rumen and then it comes back out through the reticulum and back in to the omasum. So that way you can maximize the amount of time and digestion that microbiome is really attacking it and breaking it down. So herbivores are usually eating constantly because they're consuming this lower quality food. That was something that we didn't really touch on.
No.
So that's kind of the big difference is carnivores, they tend to spend a lot of time sleeping for the most part. Herbivores tend to spend a lot of time eating. And you see this when you go to the zoo. The cats are usually sleeping in their enclosure. The herbivores are usually just sitting there grazing or feeding on whatever feed that the zookeepers bring them.
And I think that's a perfect kind of segue into these animals like activity levels because, they're herbivores, so they need to constantly be finding food and eating. But another interesting thing is like for quite a while, people thought these animals were like nocturnal, like only active at night. But through, radio collar studies and studies of these animals through observations, we found that they're awake, a lot of the times during the day. They're maybe more active during dawn and dusk, and during the midday they may reduce their activity, especially if it's really hot, because you want to conserve energy and not, you know, overheat.
Yeah. They also seem to avoid swampy areas. That was another
Mhm.
thing that I noticed from the radio collar study. They don't like it super wet.
Yeah.
So they kind of like the drier areas.
And it'd also be curious to wonder if the like grooves that we saw on the face, you mentioned it might be a blood vessel, and I wonder if that's one of their ways to kind of radiate heat away from their body, kind of
Maybe,
cool
yeah,
that
because
blood.
that's the other thing. Is this is a very dark body animal, which
Yeah.
definitely helps with the camouflage. Because as
Mhm.
we said countless times, deep, thick forest, they've got those stripes that maybe help kind of add to the camouflage for the light that penetrates through the canopy to kind of give off that same effect. But yeah, I mean, that's a dark body animal, which means that it can probably overheat quite easily. And we do see this in a lot of herbivores that there are peak foraging hours, usually earlier in the morning, and during the heat of the midday, they're usually off resting, finding some sort of shelter.
Yeah.
You want to go over to the calf a little bit? We haven't
Yeah.
really looked at the calf all that much. Yeah, so it's got the shorter face, which from what I've seen is pretty good. And the neck, like everything on the calf seems pretty right proportionally. I think the grooves are a bit more distinct on the calf than the adult, honestly.
Yeah, actually, I think they are like right underneath the
Yeah,
like
the
eye
calf looks
there.
really good. I like it
Yeah.
a lot. The tip of the tail looks kind of floofy,
Hmm.
but other than that, I mean this looks great. And this is a surprising thing is you would expect that a creature like an Okapi's being as elusive as it is would be pretty hard to breed in captivity, but they're pretty well represented in zoos.
Hmm.
Even, Okapi Conservation Project, they used to have on their property a reserve to breed some wild okapis there. Unfortunately, they had an incident with some rebels from the DRC that attacked the reserve. These were mostly illegal miners and elephant poachers, and they had attacked a lot of the staff and had killed most or either all of the okapis there. So
Wow.
that was a very unfortunate attack that happened on the facility back in 2012. And after that, they stopped breeding okapis there. But obviously, there's still a lot of accredited zoos in North America and Europe that okapi is part of the species survival program. So we have plenty of okapis in captivity just in case there is that emergency that we need to start doing some reintroductions to some areas that become deprived of okapi.
Exactly.
Yeah. But yeah, I mean this calf looks really nice. We don't know a whole lot about okapi reproduction outside of a captive setting, so we're not really going to talk about it all that much. With the male ossicones, those are used in male giraffes. Everybody knows the famous necking display where, the ossicones hit each other. We don't know if that's the case in Okapi because they're solitary and we haven't really seen them interact all that much. But who knows? Maybe there is a little bit of necking, or it's just simply that they are able to maintain their territories through their infrasound communication and their scent marking. We don't really know. This
Yeah.
guy's too secretive to really tell.
Yeah. And I also kind of find it funny that Baby Okapi really has like that ungulate kind of goofy kind of movements and running, especially.
Yeah. I mean, the running gait, it's not bad.
No, 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 not at all. I
Um,
just, yeah,
it's just they don't run that much. So
it's just
because it's
funny because with
it's a
ungulates,
forest
they've got these
animal.
long legs, but yeah,
Yeah. I mean those long legs will help you step over a lot of thick vegetation for
yeah,
sure, especially at that height.
absolutely. Fallen logs, any kind of obstacles. And I think
Do you want to
another,
open up the Zoopedia, see if
yeah,
there's anything for
but
us to
I
look
think
at?
one thing we should say about, since we were talking about their elusivity or how elusive they are, and studying them can be really hard. We can collar them and we can observe them, but in this dense jungle, that observation can be really difficult, especially with how these animals are able to blend in pretty well. So one thing we can do is use genetic samples. And so with genetic samples, we find their scat, their feces, and we take it to a lab and we run genetic analysis on it, and that can tell us a lot. It can tell us about individuals, what they're eating. It can tell us how many are in an environment. So that's one way that they were able to kind of confirm that there was, or at least there is, similar copies. Was it southwest of the Congo, I believe?
Yes.
Yeah, the Congo
Yeah.
River
They're
is
I
through
don't I
genetic
don't know if they're on the
analysis.
opposite side of the Congo River though. Are they?
I believe it said the southwest.
Okay. If they are, then it's not where the bonobos are. Because
No,
I
yeah, I don't,
checked that. I think the bonobos are further north on that side of the Congo River.
yeah, because it says southwest. Yeah, so non-invasive genetic identification confirms the presence of endangered okapi southwest of the Congo River.
Okay. Yeah. And they do actually go a little bit into the northern edge of Virunga National Park,
Hmm.
where the mountain gorillas are. But it doesn't seem to be a permanent residence for them right now. It's just an occasional disperser every here and then.
But it's interesting because with a tropical environment, scat samples are going to be kind of difficult to find because
Sure.
it's not very obvious. It breaks down really quickly because it's a very, there's a lot of insects in the tropics and other fungus and everything that uses feces as, uh, something to break down or food or whatever. So it's interesting that walking these transects, they were actually able to find their scat.
That's true.
Okay, so opening up the Zoopedia now.
Yeah.
Cool.
Endangered is the right classification. The
Mhm.
those populations seem accurate from what I've been reading.
Correct scientific name. That's good.
Yeah. Um, and then can you check the interspecies enrichment? That's really the big
Yeah.
thing that I wanted to
Species.
look
Oh yeah.
at. Yep. So you can
Yep.
see this is
That
a
looks.
very narrow part of the
Yeah.
Congo Basin. It's not a whole lot. So these are animals that have a very narrow range.
And I just want to check because let me see.
It doesn't have that southwest
No, yeah, it
population.
doesn't have like the yeah. I was just curious to see if it did. So that's
No, because it's completely isolated from the main one, which is
yeah,
this one is the Ituri forest population.
absolutely, yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think that small tip down there is like North Virunga. So
Yeah, I was just curious about that. That's good to know. Okay, species data.
yep, 1 to 2 because it's
Solitary.
solitary. Yep, the weight seems right. About 5 feet tall.
Okay. So I guess that might have been pretty accurate. They just seem larger in person.
Yeah, they're heavy though, for sure.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah. So
So habitat enrichment, food enrichment, fun facts,
is
and
there
prehensile
not
tongue. Yeah. There we
is,
go. Um,
do they not? I
oh,
swear they okay. Yeah.
okay. Yeah.
So this tells you right now that Justin does not have the tropical pack because
Yeah.
officially in the game, the Okapi does have interspecies enrichment with the Red River hog, which is an animal that it actually does overlap with in range.
Mhm.
However, there is another one that for some reason the devs decided not to put them together. Why? I have no idea. But they do also overlap with the bongo, which is a large jungle antelope found in much of West and Central Africa. So that is an animal that realistically you could put together with no copy. They would be living together naturally in the wild. And yeah, there are some areas where they overlap with chimpanzees and gorillas, but not the ones that are in Planet Zoo. So they overlap quite a great deal with the eastern chimpanzee subspecies, but Planet Zoo gave us the western chimpanzee, which is different. So that's like a good reason as to why they don't share that interspecies interaction. In Zoo Tycoon 2, it doesn't matter because they keep it at the species level with the chimpanzee.
Yeah.
And then while they're not really overlapping with gorillas that much, if they were, it would probably be the eastern gorilla, not the western gorilla, which is what we have in Planet Zoo. They do overlap with buffalo, but the buffalo subspecies we have is the Savannah Cape buffalo, not the forest buffalo.
Yeah.
Forest elephants are another one that we've mentioned, which is a separate species entirely to the bush elephant that we have in the game. And of course, African leopard is the large predator there. And there's tons of other smaller animals, small antelopes, small primates. But those are kind of the major big players. So in terms of the species in Planet Zoo that would actually coexist with Okapi in the wild, it's the Red River hog and the bongo.
And I think it's also interesting to show that the Zoopedia actually has the class, order, family, and genus, which is pretty
Oh
cool.
yeah, it
Down
does
here
at
at
the
the
bottom
bottom,
there.
which is, good on the devs. That's really cool.
Yeah. And it's good that it hasn't changed.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's stayed very consistent. So I think we'll move on to the
The
tier
tier
list.
list. Cool.
Okay. So obviously we did the Amur leopard on our first episode. That is currently sitting in A tier. So now we get to decide where the Okapi is going to go. Justin, do you want to kind of start us off with your thoughts?
Yeah, okay. So I think overall color looks really good. Um, the grooves on the face, it's really nice attention to detail. The stomach, it's a ruminant, so a large kind of round stomach makes sense. Looks pretty accurate. I think honestly, and the ears, I think the only real issue I have is the ears seem a little too pointy, not quite as round as I'd expect. But regardless, aside from that, coloration wise and everything else, I'd probably put it in the A tier along with our Amur leopard.
Yeah. I also am gonna say A tier. I think really the big thing is that the ossicones look wicked long. Like other than that, this is really, really good. Like the legs look nice, the stripes look nice. The tail tufts a bit thick, but I think that's kind of negligible. Like the ossicones is just, to me, it's pretty noticeable. Like you don't really see Okapi specimens with ossicones that long, at least from what I've found. But that could be wrong. If there's an Okapi expert that wants to say that they can get that long, feel free to let us know. But I would also go with A tier, and which means we didn't even need our tiebreaker, because as you see, Megan is not here. She got a new job doing black bear work in Georgia, so she's going to be preoccupied with that for a while. It's our field work's kind of intense, and prevents us from doing a lot with internet and having a reliable schedule. So we wish Megan the best of luck, and maybe she'll join us later on when she's got a different position. But this is important for her, and we're all happy that she found this position and she's doing her best. So we do have our friend Lane Arthur, who couldn't make it today either. He also put Okapi in A tier, but he is a incoming master's candidate at Utah State University. So we are unanimous on it being an A tier. So now the question is,
what's next?
Better than the leopard or no?
I would probably say yes, just because I feel like with for me, I put the leopard in I think B tier. Just
I think it's better than the leopard too. Not that the leopard is bad by any means.
Yeah.
It's just that it looks a bit more like a North Chinese leopard than an Amur leopard. Whereas like there's nothing that they could have, taken away from the Okapi to make it less, because the Okapi is just so unique.
Yeah.
So I kind of agree with putting it like it's a high A tier. If the ossicones were shorter, I probably would put an S. And I think it's a really good animal to put if you're doing any sort of tropical exhibits. Like it fits really well. It's it's an ungulate with those solid hooves, so it's a nice one to put in alongside the bongo. Which even though you're not supposed to, you can put them together. It's probably fine. So we will rank the Okapi here. So now, are you ready, Justin?
I am ready to find out what our next video will be on.
Wheel. Eurasian lynx? Okay.
All right. Awesome.
Good thing you got the Europe pack.
Exactly.
Okay. This is going to be fun.
Yeah.
It's our first European animal.
It'll be a fun exhibit to make.
Yeah. This will be a cool one to talk about for sure. There's definitely a lot on Eurasian lynx because it's got such a wide range. So I'm excited for this.
Yeah, so am I.
After this, we're going to really try our hardest to get videos out every 2 weeks for all of you. And we really thank you for the patience that you've had on this one, because we had a lot of kinks to work out and some personal stuff going on. But we'd love to see you for the next one. We now have a Twitter page up. So if you want to follow us at Wildlife Wire, that's a great way to get updates. And we'll also be posting and retweeting a lot of ongoing conservation work for your guys' knowledge in the meantime, maybe even sharing some artwork. So thank you, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.